Once again, hi. Hello. We are now at the very beginning of our conference on the unknown legacies of Nuremberg trials. This is a great opportunity to talk about these legacies with the author of an excellent book that has recently been published in 3 languages, so originally in English. So, Prosecuting the Powerful, War Crimes and the Battle for Justice, but also in German language, Vor Gericht, Kriegsverbrechen und die Geschichte der internationalen Justiz, mit neuen Kapiteln für die deutsche Ausgabe. So what about these new chapters for German edition?
Yes, I'm happy with that. And with the Polish edition, Ukarać bezkarnych has also come out. So the book originally in the English version, it went to press at the end of last year. And of course, it's been a rather dramatic 2025 as well. So the fall of Assad, I visited Syria in the spring of this year, and the arrival of Donald Trump in the Oval Office has, let us say, changed things in quite a lot of different ways.
Our guest is Steve Crawshaw, and the book is Prosecuting the Powerful. Is justice possible when war crimes have been committed? Do we need justice? Why should retribution, reconciliation, or something else be the goal? Steve Crawshaw explores how the landscape of global justice has changed and reports on the history of putting national leaders on trial. But he also shows very well how a certain language of justice developed historically, how painful it was to establish institutions, and who the key actors were. Steve is former UK director at Human Rights Watch, former director of the Office of the Secretary General at Amnesty International, and also, what is extremely important, former foreign correspondent at the Independent, British journal, and he was able to observe the birth of Polish Solidarity movement, among other things, in 1970s and 1980s, and also, what was very crucial for this book, the war in Yugoslavia. I would like to start our conversation by quoting your opinion from the introduction of this book, that you wrote that if you had written this book in 2005, it would have been too optimistic. The world seemed simpler then. Well, what did happen to your optimism, and what happened to the world in the meantime?
My optimism, thank you so much, and thank you that you are here. My optimism hasn't gone, I have to say. So as I mentioned in the book, yes, 20 years ago, just after I arrived at Human Rights Watch, I left the Independent, became the UK director at Human Rights Watch. And it was just after the creation of the International Criminal Court, which was conceived in Rome in 1998, or agreed in Rome in 1998, came into being in 2002. And the proposal that I rediscovered while writing this book from 20 years ago was written in the heady days where it seemed anything was possible. We had, after 50 years of nothing really, after Nuremberg, almost nothing, we had had a tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where it ended up with all of the main war criminals were indicted or convicted there, the most senior leaders. We had a tribunal for Rwanda, we had the International Criminal Court, and it seemed that really this was the end of the age of impunity. And I was very much taken with that spirit of hope, which had begun in the end of the 80s, the 90s, and continued. And in the meantime, of course, we saw most obviously Syria, but not only Syria, but we had this complete impunity for Assad's war in Syria, largely because he was protected at the Security Council by Russia. But then as I was writing the book, I started thinking about it before 2022. By the time I was writing it, was already the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then again, while I was writing it, was what happened with the atrocities of October the 7th, and then the killing of so many in Gaza after that. So all of those things sharpened something that was already in my mind, But I think, as all of us are clear, especially in the past couple of years, but before that also, how governments unfortunately still tend to look at one set of crimes in one kind of way, depending on who has committed them, not looking at how serious is the crime, but looking at who has committed them. And that's very problematic. So in a way, the book, which still contains a lot of hope, because we see extraordinary things that have changed, things which Raphael Lemkin, who created the word genocide, and Hersch Lauterpacht, who conceived of the phrase and revived the phrase crimes against humanity, they played an important part at Nuremberg. They could never have dreamed of how far things have moved forward on the one hand, but at the same time, we see very powerful governments who are trying to stop justice in its tracks. So the book now ended up being about the tussle, if you like, between those who care about justice and those who care about it only in the sense of trying to destroy justice. I still think that those who care about it most can win, but it's a very challenging time for sure.
Uh-huh. And you mentioned this, some of these figures, some of these great actors, Lemkin, Lauterpacht, but you mentioned also in the book the Ferenc and other also. Yeah. Is global justice, according to you, about such great figures, such institutional entrepreneurs, so great people, or any their agency or will, determination to change something, or it's rather a collective effort, or maybe perhaps a series of coincidences?
It's a very good question. I suppose, in a sense, a mixture of all three of those, but I think there's clearly a lot of agency that's there. So what I portrait in the book, and I discovered many news stories while I was writing it, which I found deeply impressive in so many ways. You have the individuals who do extraordinary things, and Raphael Lemkin, Polish Jew from Lviv, now Lviv in Ukraine, Hersch Lauterpacht, also British, but his family were also from Lviv, personally connected to the Holocaust. They did extraordinary things. Ben Ferenc, born in Romania, but grew up basically American. And all of those people became absolutely determined in their different ways to make change. So his first two were important for Nuremberg. Ben Ferenc, who was an extraordinarily young prosecutor at Nuremberg. At the age of 27, he became the chief prosecutor at one of the trials. But he also was really important with the International Criminal Court, and together with a handful of others, who said, how can we just have one Nuremberg which stands in isolation? We need to make this universal. Theoretically, that was agreed by everybody after 1945 and after the Genocide Convention in 1948, which calls for the genocide to be punished. But of course, there was no framework to be punished. So those individuals play an important role. But I think that the sense of the collective will of people to believe in change is also incredibly important. And I'm very privileged in my own life to have seen that sometimes. You mentioned that I was living in Poland at the time when Solidarity, this really unthinkable opposition movement, grew up. And I think people often forget. First, I regret that Solidarity itself has been partly forgotten. Everybody knows about the Cold War, everyone knows about the fall of the Berlin Wall, everybody knows about the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev, a Soviet leader, and then Nelson Mandela was free. That narrative has survived in history, but the fact that Solidarity 9 years before the Berlin Wall came down, and when Leonid Brezhnev, the guy who sent tanks everywhere, he was in power, that's often forgotten. And I was very, very privileged to live through that in Poland, to see really an entire society say, this is not how things should be. This is how we believe that things should be. And making that change, it seemed to be stopped by tanks, but actually it never really was. It never went back to the status quo. And I believe there are many parallels for that in the context of justice, where I remember this vividly. I was young then, and it influenced me deeply, of seeing all of the people who said, this is crazy what the Poles are trying to do. This is not going to go anywhere good. This will certainly end badly. When the tanks came 16 months later, he said, yes, we told you it was too much. But actually, it was that boldness of vision that was important. The same boldness of vision existed with the International Criminal Court. And then going back to the earlier part that we just discussed, you then get to a really difficult crossroads when you have what seems so unthinkable, an American president who arrives who just hates justice with such a passion, or who loves impunity, but differently. He loves it for himself, he loves it for his friends. And if I'm looking for one big political change, Trump is Trump, and there's not much we can do about him in the direct sense. But I think that European politicians need to find their voices in confronting a man who literally wants to destroy the International Criminal Court. I mean, he's taken steps to do that. And of course, Netanyahu in Israel would like the same, Putin in Moscow would like the same. But the fact that the US president is on the same page as those who have been responsible for such terrible crimes, that we have not seen before. We've seen often that America likes to make its own decisions. That's kind of historically normal, if you like. But we haven't seen someone who wants to destroy justice. And until now, most European leaders, with a couple of honourable exceptions in Spain, Ireland, and a couple of others, but many European leaders, they've been ready to speak out on Ukraine, and I welcome that strongly, as I'm sure all of us in this room welcome it strongly, that when you get crazy things coming out of the American president's mouth, everybody from Friedrich Merz to Keir Starmer to Donald Tusk to Macron will speak out and say, no, 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 no. On Ukraine, we need to do this. But in terms of defending the International Criminal Court, which would be very, very difficult to recreate if he succeeds in pulling the rug from underneath it, destroying it now, you get, to me, to be very honest, startling comments from someone like Friedrich Merz, whom I respect as a politician, and other Donald Tusk, who I respect as a politician, the Polish Prime Minister. They say, oh no, if Netanyahu, for whom an arrest warrant has been requested and authorized and issued, we would certainly not arrest him if he came here. And that sense of treating the two sets of crimes differently, I think that's the biggest challenge we've got.
Okay, and I will ask about this international community and Americans and others later, but as we are now at the conference about legacies in plural of Nuremberg, I would ask the question, why, according to you, why is Nuremberg so crucial for the architecture of global justice, and which one legacy is most important to you?
That's an interesting question. Yes. So to take the broader question first, the book is full, and we've talked about some of them, is though full of figures who described themselves as Don Quixote figures, or who were described by others as Don Quixote figures. And Robert Jackson, the US chief prosecutor, he also, and I think he was quite right, reflecting back on Nuremberg after the war, he said this was a quixotic enterprise, and he described how very few people believed it could actually happen. Now, there are many, many reasons why we can criticize Nuremberg, and we'll no doubt hear about some of those in the next couple of days. These are important themes of the imbalances that were partly built into the Nuremberg process. But I think that we have to give a little bit of space to those who were trying to do it. They were working from scratch. They were building this skyscraper of justice with no precedents to work on at all. There had been some attempts after 1918, which had gone absolutely nowhere. And so this was really completely new. People like, from Britain myself, my own then Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was massively against the idea of due process and justice. He just wanted the Nazi war criminals to be put up against the wall. It was so simple, and having justice and trials like way too complicated. And so they were pushing really against a lot of pressures. Not only Jackson, but he was certainly a very important part of that. Worth also mentioning, since we're here in Berlin, there was a visionary German who was trying to do the same before this came up. So Helmut von Moltke, descendant of the great German, Bismarck's field marshal, he argued in favor of a tribunal that should happen in The Hague after the war, but the Brits, and he smuggled a note to the Brits and they completely ignored it. But Nuremberg happened, so I think the fact it was there and that it was trying to have due process, and the fact that, for example, some people were found not guilty This was not a kind of Stalin wanted it to be a Stalin-style trial, but it was not. The Russians were very unhappy when they learned that there was supposed to be proper defense as well. They said, we don't need defense. So that, I think, is the most important thing. And perhaps if I can tuck in the fact that leadership was on trial. War crimes committed by individuals, those were also important and were prosecuted in different contexts at different times in the years to come in Germany, in Poland and elsewhere. But above all, this was about leadership, and that's incredibly relevant for us today.
Okay, so this legacy is important. And I want to ask about what you partly mentioned, so this case of Soviet crimes.
Yeah.
And is it legacy of Nuremberg or lack of Nuremberg, lack of Soviet Nuremberg? So in your opinion, can it be said that the absence of Soviet Nuremberg and the failure to punish Soviet criminals just after the war indirectly led to Putin crimes and wars now?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it was a pragmatic decision. It was obviously the phrase that everybody is familiar with, victor's justice. In that sense, it was victor's justice because those crimes committed, for example, by the Western allies, the British and the Americans had killed more than 600,000 Germans in the bombings. In the earlier time when they were listing potential war crimes of the Germans in 1942, at that point, the mass bombing by the Germans of Rotterdam, London, Coventry, Minsk, Belgrade, that was on the list to prosecute the Germans because it seemed so terrible because many, many civilians were dying. But later, actually, the numbers that died in Minsk or Belgrade or London were, or even Warsaw in the aerial bombing sense, was very, very small by comparison with what happened in Germany. So it simply got airbrushed out. Similarly, the crimes committed by Russia. One of the most extraordinary stories, I think, of is a small story in a sense, but an extraordinary story in context of a Polish-German institute, I think worth remembering, is the crimes of Katyn, where tens of thousands of Poles were murdered by Stalin's forces, and which Stalin, of course, had to blame on the Germans because it couldn't have been us. And the Russians astonishingly pressed for Katyn to be included in the indictments. And the Western allies were uncomfortable saying, yes, but like this could damage everything. But once they had, there's a phrase from Macbeth in Shakespeare, where once we are so deep in, we cannot come back, basically. And so Katyn, which was actually a Russian crime, was accused against the Germans. The judges kind of ignored that. So did it help Putin? I think more what helped Putin, well, one simply is his shamelessness, which he shares with Netanyahu and he shares with Assad. But I think that he believed that he could get away with it still. And that's why I believe that we are at such a crossroads moment now. Assad believed he had complete impunity, and the West had begun to accept he was like there forever, basically. And they were telling the Syrian opposition that. And yet we all saw how in just a few days it collapsed. Now he's sitting very, very comfortably in Moscow, living in luxury in Moscow. But, there are circumstances where he could not be so valuable to the Russians. They need a Mediterranean port. There are deals that could be done. So Assad is no longer so safe. We don't know what the future is for either Putin or Netanyahu, what their own societies are likely to do. I myself I covered, as you mentioned, the former Yugoslavia as a correspondent. I met Slobodan Milosevic, then the Serb leader, in 1992 at the beginning of the war. I managed through some quite complicated circumstances to get partly bluff. I got an interview with him in his hotel at a peace conference in London. And I asked him, might you ever see yourself in the dock? And he was astonished by the idea. No, anybody who commits a war crime, of course, must be there, but me, no, completely. I'm sure he believed he never would be, but I also believed he never would be. But things change. Only 9 years after that, he was delivered by his own newly elected democratic government who's delivered to The Hague. So I think that above all, Putin has that shamelessness that he believes that there will be no consequences. And I think that it is important for leaders like that to understand that there can actually be consequences. We have one more example, for example, with Milosevic years ago, but even earlier this year, the former Philippines president, Rodrigo Duterte, who was wanted for crimes against humanity also at the ICC in connection with the mass killing of so-called drug dealers, parallels again with the American president today. But many, many thousands were killed. He was trotting around Hong Kong boasting, mocking the International Criminal Court, that they wanted, that they'll never catch me, basically. And then he flies back home to Manila and he's arrested at the airport, delivered to The Hague. So I think what's important to remember is we never know what's going to happen next. And I hope that will be true of some of the worst crimes today.
So the story about the interview with Milosevic is part of this book. So the really beautiful story. And but the very fact that Milosevic was taken to the court was also because of the American involvement. And this moves me to the next question. So is global justice an US-led order or rules-based order? I mean, but how much is this superpower, United States of America, are needed? Do we need United States as a global power to guarantee this system, international system of justice, or not? What do you think awaits us with the increasingly evident isolationism of Trump administration of the US and this MAGA movement? Do you see any functional equivalent possible to substitute for the US?
Yeah. Again, it's such a core question. And I suppose I would take it first, that last bit of your question is not just about justice. I think that we're all having that conversation. Here in Germany, it's very active. In Poland, it's very active. In my own country, in Britain, it's very active in the Ukraine context of, okay, we have a US president who clearly has lost every sense of moral compass and any sense of leadership for good outcomes, and therefore, and Friedrich Merz and other German politicians have been explicit about that, as have others in other countries, it now rests with Europe. Europeans have no other choice except to fill the gap that has been left by American leadership. On justice, I would probably slightly query your characterization of them having been a leader for global justice, with the very particular exception of Nuremberg itself, where they were incredibly important. And all the four prosecuting powers were there, and was the London conference before Nuremberg where everything was hashed out. But really, Jackson was the one who had the moral compass of driving it through. He also famously said, others will judge us on the basis of what we have done at Nuremberg as well. And he had that sense that this was a historic cornerstone for everything else, which was not just about prosecuting Nazis, it also had reflections for the behavior of everybody. So America, sadly, as we're all conscious, has very often, it's had such a strong belief that it is always right in itself, that it's actually always had a great mistrust of global justice, really, because it likes to dispense justice, but doesn't like it to be decided evenly. So it dislikes international institutions in general, it dislikes international conventions. It waited 40 years before ratifying the Genocide Convention, truly extraordinary. And even then, the only reason it happened was because Ronald Reagan was embarrassed about some other issues to do with a visit to Germany a couple of years earlier. So they've always been really wary. Bill Clinton, who was the president at the time of the Democrat president at the time of the Rome Conference where it was decided, he and even Madeleine Albright, who was really a human rights friendly Secretary of State, they wanted literally, they used the words, what can we do to blow up the conference? They asked the US War Crimes ambassador, who was shocked by the question, but they didn't want it to happen. George W. Bush, when he arrived, made more active attempts to destroy the court. But in the meantime, American leaders have, if you like, come to terms. Bush partly came to terms with the court, so they allowed, for example, an indictment for Darfur to go through the Security Council. Presidents Obama and Biden seem to cooperate or collaborate with the court on a number of things, including especially on Ukraine. But, and this is an important but, we now have a president in the Oval Office who is off the scale in terms of his crazy, damaging implications of what he is doing. But I think we shouldn't forget that Joe Biden as well was absolutely furious. He called it outrageous when the International Criminal Court looked at on the one hand, the crimes that have been committed in Ukraine, and quite rightly, destruction of infrastructure, starvation of civilians in Mariupol, and so on and so forth. So the Americans and other Western governments quite rightly strongly approved the indictment of one, but then when a similar indictment for similar crimes came up a year later, it was called, quote, outrageous. So sadly, America has not been, I say with 1945 as that important exception, has not been that great favor of global justice. What I welcome is the fact that gradually it had more come to accept it. Immanuel Kant had a brilliant phrase, which remains so relevant more than 2 centuries later, talking about how we punish, murder, thieving, attack, all of these things. If I attack you, I can be punished for that. The same kind of things that Lemkin also challenged of like the small crime versus large crime. So if an individual commits a crime, then of course they should be punished for that crime. But Kant talked about the wild and lawless freedom which governments like to have. Now, 230 years after he wrote that, we still see that the United States adores that wild and lawless freedom, which Kant identified as how, in a sense, that wild and lawless freedom builds an instability into the way the world is. And I think it's very difficult to argue against the fact that Trump is currently creating a more unstable world, and an international institution which supports, maintains the rule of law, helps to create a more stable world.
In this context, so what tells us the case of Netanyahu? So what does it tell us about the global justice or the system, this architecture of justice, or in relation to global powers and superpowers and other powers?
It's really interesting. It tells us a lot. And I think the biggest question is this going to be what we've seen, not just in the past 2 years, but in the past year and the past even 6 months, especially, I would say, is this going to be a wake-up moment? So leaving America to one side, which we've partly discussed, and America has often plowed its own furrow, has often gone its own way. And clearly under Trump, it completely goes its own way. But I think it's really interesting for me to observe, and for all of us, I guess, to look carefully at how European governments are looking at the court which they created a quarter of a century ago. So all of the European governments, Germany played an important role, France played an important role, Poland played an important role, Britain played an important role, let alone somewhere like the Netherlands, which is the capital of international justice. So all of those ones created the court. They claim still to support that court. And yet when the court comes out with something, which, just to remind ourselves, the chief prosecutor of the court, Karim Khan, he commissioned 6 legal experts to advise him before requesting the arrest warrants. And those 6 all distinguished themselves, but included, for example, a former senior Israeli ambassador, Theodor Meron, who was also the former president of the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. All of those said, yes, arrest warrants are justified, given what was already in play in spring 2024. He then requested it. The judges then sat for 6 months looking at that carefully. They came back unanimously and said it was appropriate. So at that point, I think that the governments need to look themselves in the mirror, so to speak, and go how come I, as a prime minister who's probably not even a lawyer, and if I am, I'm certainly not as distinguished as those international lawyers, how come I will call it to say, no, that's very inappropriate to use the idea of war crimes? Reminding ourselves also that Karim Khan has not even mentioned yet genocide, but crimes against humanity. Genocide, a very complicated word to define, but crimes against humanity, which include starvation and extermination and murder, many of the things we associate with genocide. I think that is something we hear it a little bit less loudly from those governments now than we did at the beginning of this year. That's partly because Netanyahu, with his friend Trump, has been so shameless in continuing to double down on crimes. And I, like all of us, I welcome the fact that the guns and the bombs have to some extent fallen silent in Gaza, although West Bank is actually getting worse at the same time. But we still need to address what has happened. The quotes from Friedrich Merz that I referred to briefly earlier of how it would be quote unquote absurd to arrest Netanyahu if he came here. Donald Tusk saying similar things, Macron also suggesting the same thing. I mentioned those quotes, but it is interesting, all of those came from the beginning of the year. As far as I know, it has not been repeated in recent months, by which time we now have, never mind crimes against humanity, which are obviously there. I was quite cautious in the original edition of the book, although it's in the German edition. In the meantime, Amnesty International has called it genocide. Human Rights Watch has called it genocide. Perhaps most importantly in some ways, the brilliant Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, wrote a searing report called Our Genocide, which I find a very, very powerful title. Physicians for Human Rights Israel, another respected group. And then most recently, a couple of months ago now, a UN Commission of Inquiry chaired by the former president of the Rwanda War Crimes Tribunal have all used the word genocide. At that point, for any other European politician, let alone a non-lawyer, but frankly, even if a lawyer, for any politician to say, no, I understand better than all of those people, is, to use Friedrich Merz's word, frankly absurd. And I think that's that point that I hope that those European, they are now sitting a bit more silent. I hope they have thought, actually, we can't back this. And the fact that Trump adores Netanyahu. Well, of course he adores Netanyahu. He more or less adores Putin. He's spoken marvelous things about the North Korean leadership. So that's the kind of thing that he loves. He, of course, has demanded an amnesty, never mind the international war crimes. He's demanded an amnesty for Netanyahu for his corruption trial, which has caused, unsurprisingly, some indignation inside Israel as well. So Trump's lawlessness is a given. But I am enough of an optimist that I still believe that European politicians can go, this is not the way to go. And going back to your earlier question about individuals versus collectives, I think that we as societies have an important role in holding our own governments to account and understanding it's not just a moral issue, it is a practical issue because stability is based on rule of law. And if you start picking and choosing whose murder or whose mass murders you would wish to either prosecute or ignore, then that's obviously going to be unstable for everybody. It will be worse, certainly for Palestinians, clearly, but frankly for Israelis as well. When I was in Israel and West Bank last year, the most sensible and brilliant Israelis I was speaking to were all saying we need to have this accountability because this will not do us and our security any good if we have these festering wounds unaddressed in the years to come.
You mentioned this vocabulary used by this organization you have worked for, so the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. So what is the role of this or similar or these organizations? So does it matter?
I think it does. Again, anybody in the room can form their own judgment in a sense. And I guess and hope that some of you will support some of those organizations and similar ones, that they represent societies very much. Amnesty International especially is a mass membership organization. And I know that Amnesty Germany has an incredibly important role to play. That is about the voices of society saying we actually care. So Amnesty International was created in 1961. Human Rights Watch was about 15 years later, I guess, 20 years later. And both of them are part of a broader sense of civil society having an incredibly important voice. I was in Ukraine a few times while I was writing the book, and I was so impressed. When the war began, I didn't know what to do with it almost, because there were so many war crimes. And then gradually I realized that actually for me, the subject would not be look how many war crimes there are, which is obvious, but look at the incredible courage of the civil society organizations, the Ukrainian organizations, who go very, very close to the front lines. They risk their lives in order to document the crimes. Often they were going very shortly after the Russians had been there, because they needed to get the fresh evidence, including documents left behind and so on. And those people risking their lives because they believe that this is what can bring stability and justice in the long term. And I believe that each of us as members of our society, we play a role in that for sure.
Uh-huh. So before I ask the audience to ask questions, so I would like to ask about your personal attachment or emotional attachment to the subject and to the people you describe. So because you have this bad people, good people, you have victims.
Yeah.
So what about your emotions?
Yeah, it's a good question. In a sense, I mean, I tried for it not to be written as a very emotional book, but in a sense, it is a very personal book. And sometimes when I first describe, people think, oh, it's going to be a list of war crimes. I hope, well, you've seen it. I hope it's not actually a dark book to read. It has many dark themes within it, but actually it's about those confronting darkness. And of course, we're sitting here in the Pilecki-Institut. I mean, there's an example with Witold Pilecki of somebody who, in the midst of the most unbelievable darkness, I'm kind of left for words, including actually having briefly looked at your exhibition here in the Institute, left without words of the courage of those who, in the midst of that darkness, have a vision of something else, that we must get to a place over there and not in the darkness that we are. So Witold Pilecki did that, Raphael Lemkin did that, Jan Karski, parallel in some ways to Witold Pilecki, did that. As mentioned, I was so privileged to live by chance. I had arrived in Poland to do other things. I was studying Polish theatre and then teaching English, but I lived there in the middle of, again, huge social change that was, I have to say, that was very emotional to me. And later I was privileged as a journalist in 1989. I had just been made, I'm so fortunate, I had just been made the East Europe editor at The Independent. So I was responsible for the region. I was in Leipzig on the 9th of October, where a regime backs down. As all the Germans in the room would certainly be aware, but Leipzig has also got slightly forgotten, that it was the courage of tens of thousands of people who basically, when the regime threatened to kill, the regime backed off at the last moment. That was one of the most emotional evenings in my life. It was also very emotional for me seeing the changes I saw in Poland. It was extraordinary for me to see the change. I was in Belgrade as Milosevic was falling. And I feel that for me personally, this book is certainly paying tribute. I mentioned the word Don Quixote earlier, to those who have achieved extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. So in that sense, yes, it is an emotional sense of just, or to use a slightly less strong word, simply caring about what individuals are doing. It of course has geopolitics, it has an understanding of politics, I hope, built into it. I've observed politics over many years. And one of the things I've taken away, in fact, both as a journalist and as a human rights advocate, is how often those politicians who claim to be quote unquote pragmatists, the overlap between quote unquote pragmatism is a good thing in many contexts. You don't want to be kind of crazy running off cliffs. But how often actually pragmatism is an overlap with short-sightedness, I think is very remarkable. And I think we see that. So in a sense, this is in praise of those who have been courageous in creating change, have helped to create that change. And I suppose perhaps for us, the reader, to take lessons from that, of how we can absorb some of that moral courage, the Zivilcourage, to use the German phrase, to use that Zivilcourage in our own lives.
Okay, maybe some of you want to ask a question, short question to Steve, please.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your comments about Netanyahu. Maybe you understand, you must have heard about the repression of pro-Palestinian solidarity activists here, including Jewish Israelis. It extends to all parts of the society, academics, artists, as well as people demonstrating in the streets. But I'm wondering why you didn't say more clearly that Amnesty International just published a report about how the genocide in Gaza is ongoing. Or are you not aware of that report?
No, of course I'm aware of it. So we covered quite a lot in a short time. I mean, you're absolutely right. That one was published. And I did refer briefly to the fact that in the West Bank, for example, things are in fact getting worse rather than better. So leaving that Amnesty International report aside, I think that the first part of your question refers to what has been happening in Germany. And you're right, I think that's incredibly important.
And in the UK.
And in the UK also, but I think that actually what's happening in Germany is in the UK also. But I think actually what's been happening certainly in what's been happening in the UK, there are a whole number of issues in the UK, but I think that Germany is particularly interesting because for me, I absolutely understand the good intentions of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel talking about Staatsräson. I mean, it's obvious the good place that has come from. Similar comments from Olaf Scholz, and in a sense similar now we have with Friedrich Merz. All of that, you can see the good place that has come from. And I myself, as I think was briefly alluded to earlier, so I studied Russian and German. I lived here in Germany, including as a correspondent for The Independent. And traveled here a lot. I was here in Berlin a bit as a student, but was living here for years. And I wrote a book which I was happy it came out in German as well, and it was nicely received, which was, in short, praising it was 20 years ago the book was written. It was called Easier Fatherland. It was how Germany had changed to confront over the years. The narrative thread of the book was looking at all the different history books, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 21st century. And as I'm sure everyone in the room is aware, but the details I still find startling, I quote them a bit here, the 180-degree changes in history books were remarkable. So in that context, I of course welcome that Germany has been, a good friend to Israel over years. What the bit of the debate that I find most interesting, and I do find it extremely powerful, and it's why I'm very grateful to the German publishers Quadriga at IPON that it's now out in German, because I think that sense of what does never again actually mean, and a Jewish friend actually has written an interesting piece some time ago, but it's about to be reprinted, about how never again means too much never again to us in the Israeli context. And I feel that could be said of the German debate, that never again means never again to them, to the group that we, Germany, did particularly terrible things to, as opposed to the more universal one. And I feel I'm not living in Germany at the moment. You in the room are closer to it, but I think that divide between how never again is understood, is it about that particular set of events, or is it about the principle? As you say, incredible that Jewish and sometimes Israeli Jewish people have been arrested. The one that I focus on here most, because I find it so strange, unsettling, to use another word, which I'm guessing that many of you in the room will be familiar with, was Masha Gessen, the New Yorker writer who I knew a bit when she was they were a Russian activist, had received the Hannah Arendt Prize for brilliant work on their Ukraine writing. But when they say something sharp about Gaza, that prize was almost unawarded. The ceremony was cancelled and so on and so forth. Now, for me, that's the one that I do tease out in detail in the book, because it has so much craziness built into it, that Gessen, whose own family were murdered in the Holocaust, and yet a prize is taken away because it's blamed the wrong people. Tick when they blamed Putin, but big cross when they blamed somebody else. And so I think, thank you for questioning, because I think it's incredibly important. It's why I'd be super happy if any German politician were to read this book, because I don't understand it. I am still very sympathetic to what I believe that modern Germany is trying to do more generally. And I just think that on this particular issue, I just believe that Germany has got it badly wrong. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one also refers to situation in Germany and other European countries, but in terms of applying the principle of universal jurisdiction, pursuing the international justice or bringing perpetrators of international crimes to justice. I wanted to ask about the British cases, whether there are structural investigations opened in these current conflicts or not. And the second question refers to your experience in advocacy for human rights and addressing the needs of victims of mass conflicts, whether considering these imbalances you mentioned, you see some ways to, optimal ways to address the needs, expectations of victims in Ukraine, but in particularly in Gaza, whose situation differs in terms of international recognition of those demands.
Yeah. So tell me if I've got in the part of the question wrong, but on the universal jurisdiction point, I think the question was partly about here in Germany, where, as you perhaps know, Germany has played an incredibly important role on universal jurisdiction. And I hesitate to be certain, and some in the room might correct me, but I feel that probably Germany's own history has influenced that. I mean, Germany has become a world leader. Germany, which I think we'll also be addressing in the next couple of days, at the time, opinion polls showed, and especially after Nuremberg was over, how there was a deep disquiet here. It was seen as like, how dare you blame all of us German, a great rejection of Nuremberg and what it had been. And the word victor's justice was used a lot then. In the meantime, over the next half century, Germany became this key leader. And so when it came to the International Criminal Court discussions in Rome in '98, the slogan for the German government, the German delegation in Rome was, from Victor Hugo, an idea whose time has come. And Germany was a really important voice. I think it's part of that continuum that Germany has played a really important role. And one of the bits I said that I started thinking about the book before the full-scale invasion. At that time, I very much had in mind, in terms of progress, the really important trial in Koblenz that finished in 2022 with Anwar Raslan, Syrian torturer, torture chief, who received a long jail sentence at a time when it seemed that there was no possibility of any accountability for any of the crimes in Syria. All of that has now changed, of course, and I heard a lot about that when I was in Damascus and traveling through Syria a few months ago, the passion, if you like, for how we can find some accountability. But I am struck by how, not only in the context of Syria, also in other stuff, also Islamic State, but that Germany has played a really important role. And gradually, and that's partly, I don't know if you call it German leadership or not, but certainly other countries are more going in that direction than they were. I think to some extent people are looking at the German example and seeing that as a little bit of a wake-up call. And I think there are likely to be Ukraine cases as well. Gaza will be very interesting to see what will happen on that. As we briefly alluded to earlier, I think one of the big questions is, will Israeli courts themselves start to deal with it? At the moment, it still feels very difficult to imagine that. But as both Israelis and Palestinians said to me when I was there, sometimes that point of darkness is when you get the turnaround and you get the understanding. So I feel that universal jurisdiction is something which, in parallel to those other international institutions, is of incredible importance, and certainly here. Your second question about the imbalances and specifically about the voice of the victims. Thank you for the question as well, because I didn't sufficiently address it here. I think that's one of the biggest changes there has been in the past 20 years, but probably in the past 10 years especially, that when Nuremberg was created, of course it was a court created by lawyers. I mean, how could it not be? There was no kind of precedent. And the voices of the victims that we heard were very powerful, for sure, but were kind of artificially inserted, if you like. It was the lawyers who created the whole structure and like, oh, we've got a victim, okay. And it was very powerful for everybody in the courtroom when that happened, but it was the exception rather than the rule. Even when the International Criminal Court was created and was dealing, for example, with Democratic Republic of Congo, the first things, which I worked on quite a lot when I was at Human Rights Watch, there was great unhappiness amongst ordinary Congolese that they felt really pretty much left out. There were moments when the ICC proceedings were transmitted live into Eastern Congo, which was a small start, but there's the English phrase, and I think probably it exists in German as well, nothing about us without us, which is used especially about disabilities and other things. But I think it's true of human rights, those who've suffered from human rights atrocities or whose relatives have been killed, that's a change that's happened, and the ICC is much more open and thinking about the role of the victims, who are much more present. And many of the trials that we see, including the universal jurisdiction trials that you mentioned, in those universal jurisdiction trials, the victims are kind of central, basically. So I welcome that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And the last questions. In this story, in this great story about quest for global justice, who is your favorite actor in this story?
Oh, that's so unfair. I'll have to choose favourite children. Or favourite parents in this case. Gosh. It's really hard to choose one. I mean, many of you may have read the Philippe Sands book, East-West Street, which takes both Lemkin and Lauterpacht. So they both had their moment in the sun. Otherwise, I might go for that. Pilecki doesn't actually get a mention in the book. He kind of should. Jan Karski does, doing similar things. Partly because he's not so well known and because he encapsulates a bit of everything, I might choose the Prime Minister, President of Trinidad and Tobago, A.N.R. Robinson, Ray Robinson, who he embodies that sense of this kind of obsessional figure. So A.N.R. Robinson was a student at Oxford in the 1950s, and he was a student together with an American called Robert Wurtzel, who was doing a PhD on the Nuremberg trials. And both of them had these kind of student conversations in their student rooms in the pub and everywhere else, saying like, well, we've had Nuremberg, but why would we not have an international one? So that was them as students. You expect to have student conversations that then get forgotten and go nowhere. But he and the others remained obsessed by this through the 1950s until there he was as a student at Oxford, later goes into politics, becomes an MP, becomes a minister, becomes prime minister. And as the Berlin Wall was coming down in autumn 1989, and it's not completely by chance that things had opened up, this quixotic dreamer, at that point, he puts onto the agenda of the UN General Assembly the idea there should be a permanent war crimes tribunal and international criminal court. And it was the request of Trinidad and Tobago to the UN General Assembly that this should happen that kick-started that process. So I would take him maybe, and if I'm allowed a second one, I should probably cheat, because he was doing it, it wasn't dangerous for himself. But I would also take, again, only symbolically, because there are many like it, but Alexandra Matvichuk, Ukrainian, her organization Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine won the Nobel Peace Prize quite rightly, and I portrait them a little bit, the work they do, taking enormous risks to document in the belief that this can create change. But I would take those two, one in the 1950s and then the 80s, one the present day, but they are only symbols because there are many amazing people.
Thank you. So the next question. So will the international community succeed in bringing Vladimir Putin to justice, according to you?
They must. I hope they must is my shortest answer. A slightly longer answer. We don't, of course, know, and that's the whole point. There are a list of reasons that any of us in this room could go with of why that is unlikely to happen. But I'm very fond of a quote from Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian opposition figure, dissident, who was kicked out of Russia because he was too dangerous to Russia, if you like. He was in prison and then kicked out as part of the transfer that happened last year. And the KGB, the FSB guy on the plane out of Russia said, sitting next to him, said, "Look out of the window because this is the last time you will see your country." And Kara-Murza turned round to the FSB guy and said, "I am a historian and I know that I will be back here much sooner than you realize." Now, none of us know if he's right or wrong, but I think that that belief in the possibility of change remains really important. I very much hope, certainly for Russia itself, that they can get to that place. I don't feel confident, but a strong, healthy Russia needs to find accountability for what has been done in its name, I think.
You use such a phrase about a Faustian struggle between despair and hope. So which one is up now? So which at the moment? So the more hope or more despair?
It's kind of like this. 20 years ago, as we discussed, 20 years ago, it was definitely the hope. As I started writing and I was seeing Anwar Raslan being convicted in Koblenz, it was partial hope. The arrival of Trump casts everything into doubt, and so now it's still hope, but with a very big if, because it requires a real sense of solidarity across societies to say that justice does matter. I'm not sure if our politicians fully understand that.
So many thanks. Our guest was Steve Crawshaw, vor Gericht. Excuse me.
Sorry. Steve, a little bit of a contentious question, but it needs to be asked, though I'm sure you've been asked this numerous times before.
That's a prologue.
Yeah, so
Should I be quivering?
Yeah, now this is spice it up a little bit. No, but the thing is, I mean, I think many people or observers would certainly agree that today's Israel is probably not the same Israel as the Israel of Yitzhak Rabin or Shimon Peres, or even Ariel Sharon for that matter. And certainly its conduct of war is a different one than the past. I think there's simply no doubt about that at this point. However, some of your statements, at least on the face of it, could be seen or interpreted as you equating Netanyahu and Putin.
Yeah.
And here's the big question: is that it's a fair interpretation? Because nonetheless, I think even if you are highly critical of Israel's conduct of war, there's still stark differences, right? Including, I don't know, if you think about Hamas, its first child from '88.
Yeah.
It contains 1933-like visions of exterminating all Jewish people.
Yeah.
And there are many more differences.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's an incredibly important question. And I realize that although I'd alluded briefly to the atrocities of Hamas, I didn't make that fully clear. The International Criminal Court has, of course, indicted Hamas leaders. How could they not? The brutality of those crimes on those days is quite unspeakable. Hamas has told terrible lies saying, oh, this was within international law. Of course it was not. I mean, this was what happened, and I visited the scene of the music festival of peace and love was the festival. The brutal ironies of that. I visited a kibbutz where a brilliant Israeli activist for peace, where she was murdered. I talked to her son, who has himself become a peace activist following his mother's brutal murder. So the 7th of October, it cannot be overstated, the horror of that moment, whereas Putin's excuse for going into Ukraine was completely fictional, suggesting that this was a bunch of Nazis. And I actually looked at some of the comparisons in terms of Hitler's excuses for invading Poland in September 1939. And it was striking to me how many parallels there were, where Hitler said he had to defend the German population who were being treated so terrible by the Poles. That was the initial speeches he was making on the day of the invasion. So that distinction is huge. I think the confusion often arises, sometimes deliberately, sometimes merely just through confusion. But what comes later the idea that the crime by one side justifies the crime by the other. And it's kind of instinctive to us that, of course, that's not the case, because that's what international law is about. Paradoxically, it's the same argument that is heard from Palestinian extremists and those who believe and have believed over the past 20 years when there were suicide bombings in Jerusalem and so on and across Israel. And, oh, well, we're allowed to do anything to them. We can go in and blow up their wedding party because look what their government is doing to us. It's like, no. International law is absolutely clear, let alone the idea that you can go and kill people at a festival. So the difference between the starting point is very, very different. But, and I did, as you rightly say, allude to that, the fact is, and also that Putin in his dealings with his own society is absolutely an authoritarian leader. He's not quite a Stalin, where you might disappear in the middle of the night, but it is extremely difficult to have different views. Whereas in Israel, there are brilliant media, brilliant human rights lawyers, but I encourage anyone in the room who doesn't read it so much, but Haaretz, the Israeli daily, available in English as well as in Hebrew, plus 972, they brilliantly tell the truth day after day, week after week, month after month. And that is part of a democracy. The fact the Prime Minister is on trial for corruption in an odd way, but that trial is kind of ongoing. All of that are signs of a democracy. But we have the extraordinary situation, which I guess few or none of us might have expected, that a country that is a democracy in many other ways is now committing crimes, and that's where it comes back to what I said, which are very parallel to those being committed by an authoritarian leader. And I think that should give pause to us all. But thank you, an important question. Thank you.
Steve, many thanks. Our guest was Steve Crawshaw, and the book is titled in German language Vor Gericht, Kriegsverbrechen und die Geschichte der internationalen Justiz, mit neuen Kapiteln für die deutsche Ausgabe. And so many thanks once again for your visit in the Pilecki-Institut. Many thanks to the audience. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.